Hello and welcome to the Armenian News Network Room Week in Review. I'm Asbed Bedrosyan, and together with 𝐊𝐵𝐵𝐿 Manoucharian, this week we'll be talking about the following topics from the political scene in Armenia. Newly released IRI poll results, Armen Grigoryan's interview, and snap-on, snap-off.
And to talk about these issues, we have with us Asbed Kochikyan, who is an associate professor of political science and international relations at the American University of Armenia, Emil Sanamyan, a senior research fellow at USC's Institute of Armenian Studies, specializing in the politics of the Caucasus with a special focus on Azerbaijan, and Alen Zamanyan, who follows and has analyzed Armenian politics for over a decade. Hello and welcome, everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
All right, so we're back from 1 week off, and we have to do a good job of covering the topics because there are too many. But last week there were a few interesting things that came up. So the first order of business, I guess, is this new poll that was released from the International Republican Institute, the IRI. The results were published last week. This is a periodic poll, and we've seen previous results and we've talked about them. It's funded by USAID. The poll contains some surprising results, and both government and opposition camp have cherry-picked specific pieces of data to support their own arguments. We'll link the poll in our show notes, but Asbed Kochikyan, what do we know about the IRI? Let's begin with that. And why do they do polls in Armenia? What can you say about the general trustworthiness of this poll, and what results did you find particularly memorable?
Oh boy, I'm not going to start with the last part because that will be quite memorable. But the IRI is actually, along with the NDI, they're two independent nonprofit, but they say nonpartisan organizations, but in essence, in their name, it's already there. And they do conduct a lot of analyses around the world. And the IRI is not just focused on Armenia or the former Soviet space. Actually, they do a lot of work in Africa, developmental issues. And I believe that their main task is to provide policymakers in the U.S. with the information that they can base their decisions off of. And as you mentioned, 𝐊𝐵𝐵𝐿, they have conducted several polls before in Armenia. Methodologically, when you look at the conduct and the questions and the sample and so on, I believe this is the closest that we can get to any good polling organization or polling results. I think it was very important to conduct this after the war to just get what's the overall mood in Armenia. Because again, looking at the news sources and so on, policymakers or people outside of Armenia could not make sense at all of what's really going on. Opposition on the one hand, the government on the other. It was quite I think, timely and quite an interesting poll that they conducted. The questions were well asked, and I think they have a good division to also see the divisions or the demographic divisions in terms of younger people, older people, urban versus rural versus Yerevan versus cities. All in all, I think it's a good basis for analysis. It's a good basis for making speculations. Because at the end of the day, polls are also speculations. Let's not forget the Brady effect, where back in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, they conducted polls in California about a black mayor, about a black governor. Everyone said that he's going to win, but then eventually he lost. So the lying effect. So let's call it that way. A couple of things, just a snapshot, and I think we are going to talk in more detail about some of the other aspects. But for me, it was interesting to see that almost half of the population was optimistic about the future. Weird situation. After war, where with a lot of uncertainties, only 25, a quarter, were not. And overall, another highlight is that 26%, if I'm not mistaken, said that they want to leave. And I usually am combining, by the way, the strongly favor and somehow favor combinations.
And it's a highlight because it's not 100%?
Say that again, 𝐊𝐵𝐵𝐿. I didn't get the question.
It was just surprising to me too, because I thought many more people would want to leave.
Yes. Yes, in that sense, absolutely. But, the polls, the questions of polls usually, and it requires more time to analyze, but sometimes the questions that they ask, you can correlate them to recheck some of the questions that were asked to see if they actually confirm to what they were saying. So in a way that 15% being optimistic and only 25% are not being optimistic, and the question about having an eye to leave being 26% confirms that, yeah, it's quite possible that 50% are optimistic and only 25% are not. So a couple of other quick things, and we can come back to that. It's interesting that over 70% are against the withdrawal from the ceasefire agreement in Armenia. The ceasefire agreement signed in November. They just are willing to accept it as is or move along within the parameters that were set there. 55% want snap elections. That's also an interesting thing that if you're optimistic about the future, there should be more people who would be willing to not have elections, not as high as 55%. And there are several breakdowns of that in terms of when do they want it and so on. Don't forget that this was taken in February, about a month ago. And finally, when asked the question, which party that they would support. There were different parties. Obviously, my step came in about 33%, and no other party came close to that. But there's one answer there which wasn't a party, and that was about 2% said that they would vote for Ǩoçaryan. Either they thought that Ǩoçaryan is a party or by himself or as an individual who transcends political parties.
Interestingly, Asbed, Ǩoçaryan also had the least number of negatives against it.
Right. The highest being Republicans. About a quarter of the respondents said that they would never support the Republican. And second highest was Prosperous Armenia, getting 17%. And also one surprising thing there is that Bright Armenia, which has been trying to present itself as an alternative to opposition and to Nikol Pashinyan, got less than 1%, even less than the opposition group. So,
Asbed, one more comment about the results. You said that 85% were in agreement with fully complying with the ceasefire agreement, but there
70%.
Was it 70%?
Maybe including the somehow favorables.
Okay, but then most people quoted that, and in another poll, 80% also said they wanted to renegotiate the agreement.
One doesn't negate the other
aspect,
yes.
No, it doesn't negate
so
that,
it's not
but
about
the thing
fully...
is, but which one comes first, though? It's an important question to ask, right? Do they want to renegotiate and then fully comply, or do they want to comply with it?
No, the question was formulated in such a way: would you support withdrawal from the agreement at the risk of war? And majority did not support that, at the risk of war.
That's
but
right.
The following question was, would you support renegotiation of the agreement? And again, a big majority, over 80%, said yes, we support renegotiation, but it wasn't specifying what sort of renegotiation they want to do. It was not a specific question. There are a couple of problematic questions, not a couple, probably a number of problematic questions that I saw there, and one is this one about what should be the priorities as far as the ceasefire agreement. What was really glaring to me is that only 14% said that they want prisoners released. It tells me that either, I mean, of course, the spontaneous responses, but it's either a reflection of the fact that the Armenian government has engaged in a sort of cover-up of this issue and hasn't promoted this issue as an important issue publicly. So a lot of people may not just be aware that they're prisoners. And another one, again, there might be some issues with the Q&A happening there. And another thing that Asbed already alluded to, this use of Robert Ǩoçaryan as sort of the only person there. There are two problems there. On one hand, obviously Ǩoçaryan has a higher rating and also higher anti-rating, and it's not reflected there because most people did not think to name him as a party that they would either support or would never support. That's number one. Number two, the whole formulation of the question, considering how apolitical vast majority of Armenian respondents are and how unaware they are of this political processes and political parties there. So a question that should have been asked is which political leader would you support or not support? And this is something that, again, that was actually asked in one of the previous IRI polls about a year ago. And then they decided to stop asking that question. And this was, I think, a very kind of political decision not to have maybe names like Ǩoçaryan and others highlighted. Because prior to this, when they had that opinion poll, Ǩoçaryan was already the most well-ranked opposition figure. This was a year ago or a year and a half ago. So now, obviously, it's probably going to be even more so. And overall, of course, we have a problem with the fact that there's only two pollsters really operating in Armenia. One is this. It's Brevis, right? That they use to conduct the poll, and also the other one is Gallup International Armenian Office, the Armenian Marketing Association. So when you have the shortage of pollsters, it's easy. The sampling errors can be very big.
About the 14% of the respondents thinking about the prisoners of war and returning them and so on. One of the things when I saw that, I was thinking is probably it's about personalization, right? In one way or another, probably about 14% of the population has family members who are prisoners, POWs, or they know people who are POWs. So that also can be probably one explanation, not the main explanation. And the second thing is about when you ask about leaders, don't you think that the fact that you have a parliamentary parliamentary system where actually, people run by parties, not as individuals, unlike in a presidential system that they did. The question of asking which leader would you vote for becomes a bit redundant.
No. I don't think it's redundant at all, considering the political reality of Armenia, where people basically vote for number one on the list and don't even know who the rest of the people are in the list. I think it's relevant to see what actual rating Pashinyan has, what actual rating Kocharyan has, and everybody else. So that's how I would. I mean, I would not be surprised for example, that Marukyan might have a higher rating and fewer people might be aware of his political party. I think that's the case with all politicians in Armenia. Many people wouldn't be able to name the ruling party of Armenia because Pashinyan is the ruling party of Armenia rather than whatever name that might be associated with him.
When they had a question about institutions, political parties, I guess, were number one in terms of the hated, anti-rating.
Yeah. One other thing that was really glaring about this poll is this intro that IRI published on its website. So that's kind of their brief analysis of this poll results. And I found it to be really skewed in terms of what the poll actually found versus what they highlighted in their editorial about the poll. Basically they said, well, people really just want stability and jobs. They don't want anything to do with the conflict. They don't want to. But then you go through the list of items that people name as the number one issue, and it's a very split, right? It's not like jobs get over 50%. Jobs get 11%, instability gets 12%, and then you get military reform, Karabakh conflict, return of captives and missing persons, physical security, military attack, and all these other items that clearly have to do with security of the country are being sort of shoved aside as people really don't care about that. All they care about is make sure they make money and nobody bothers them. This was really, really glaring, I think, in lack of professionalism, I think, from IRI's side in terms of interpreting their own poll and presenting that to the public.
Yes, I felt like all the line items were gerrymandered so that they can conclude according to their wishes rather than what the numbers were showing.
Spontaneous responses. This is supposed to be spontaneous responses, so you could say, yes, people can talk about security in different ways, right? I mean, they could say, people say when they're concerned about jobs, they say, well, unemployment is a problem, wages is also a problem. So it's a related issue, but you have 11% say unemployment and 1% say wages, right? And then you have people talk about security in different ways. They can say it's a Karabakh conflict, it's a lack of military reform, or territorial border issues or physical security. All of these items are obviously part of the same problem.
Yeah, between 7 and 9 of the line items were related to the fallout from the war in Artsakh.
So I don't think it's gerrymandered, but it's definitely not well organized in terms of presentation of final product, and clearly misleading as far as the IRI and actually the headline of this poll.
There are two questions that you can look at it differently. One question is about what is the main problem your household is facing, and the other one is what is the main problem, the most important problem that your country is facing. And when you look at the first answer about the household, it becomes socioeconomic issues. And interestingly, healthcare is up there probably because of pandemic, not high, but still there. Economy, housing, wages, healthcare, and only the fifth or the sixth item is the impact of war on families, personally. So there is a distinction between, how do you feel it on yourself, and then overall, conceptually thinking about the country as a whole.
Yeah.
Emil, it didn't come across to me like the Armenian government is not particularly preoccupied with the release of POWs and others. Almost daily there are articles talking about this issue in the Armenian press.
Aspet, but when you look at the media that has the most number of listeners or readers, which is government funded, so public TV, for instance, which has a huge share of the TV viewership market, they do talk less about it, and the government's position has been that don't talk about it because this is affecting the negotiations. So I do think there is a little bit of whatever the government talks about or chooses not to talk about, they are able to, the opinion polls reflect what they hear in the media, and many people are just not listening and reading what we are posting on Grung, and I think
there is the political class, and then there is the public, right? This is supposed to be the sampling of the public rather than the political class. So the public gets most of their information from really shallow reporting, either by public TV or by I don't know, Perfect TV or whatever it's called. So you have this kind of skewed impressions, very much influenced by whatever the government dominant line is. Probably you should scroll through Pashinyan's Facebook, see how many times he posted about POWs and how many times he posted about his opposition. So that,
No, I mean, they criticize the opposition for raising this issue. They're saying, you're actually a traitor for raising this issue.
Yeah. But I mean, obviously, the issue is that the government's trying to cover up issues that make it look bad, and it doesn't.
So we can say that the issue is politicized.
Absolutely, like everything else.
So the poll shows an interesting difference based on the disaggregation categories that Aspet Kochikyan mentioned. For instance, on the question of support for prime minister, the favorability rating differed greatly between the community type, Yerevan, urban, rural, and education level, and there are a few other categories such as age and so forth. But for instance, on the community type, if you ask, the support for prime minister, in Yerevan, that number is 41%. So all of Armenia, it's 54 or 55%, but in Yerevan, it's 41%, with only 17% saying strongly that they support the prime minister. In urban, I guess other cities, it's 60%, and in rural, it's 66%. This is, counterintuitive to me, but
not at all, Hovik. Not at all. I mean,
yeah,
I think
that part makes a lot of sense to me.
Because I would expect that in the rural regions, most people, those would be bearing the brunt of the economic issues. Those would be bearing the brunt of actually sending people to the military.
You just have to look at the history. You have to look at the history of Armenian polling and Armenian politics to realize that in every single election cycle, with every single leader, you had much stronger opposition to incumbent inside Yerevan than anywhere else. There would be a couple of exceptions, maybe Gyumri, also Vanadzor. Just look at every election cycle. Rafi Ovanesyan won in Gyumri and Vanadzor and some other places like that. So this is part of the sort of the structure of Armenian politics, where you have the smaller the community is, the more vulnerable people are in terms of ability to dissent. And it's not just that, it's also the economic factor. Most people just have government jobs. They don't want to, risk their position. They might not have as much access to different kind of information that people get in Yerevan, just observing protests at all times, that happen, etc. So that's been a recurring issue with every incumbent, that every incumbent would be able to maintain stronger support in rural areas than in Yerevan. So that's I don't think that's surprising at all.
Well, I guess the next one is also not surprising. Based on the education level, so those who have primary or secondary education, 61% support Pashinyan. Those or slightly support or strongly support. Those who have vocational training, I guess, around 71% of those.
Yeah, that also makes a lot of sense, Vhovik. I don't think there's anything surprising there. The main promise of Nikol Pashinyan is sort of this Bolshevik distribution of property, right? People who have stuff and people who don't have stuff, and people who don't have stuff want some of that stuff the people that have it now. So the fact that the lesser educated, the less money people would still support Pashinyan more than the others makes a lot of sense, because that's the promise of Pashinyan. That's all it's all about. It's about money.
That's the default definition of populism, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, let me ask then the question this way, Aspet Kochikyan. How would these numbers, in your opinion, influence campaigning if elections started, for instance? How would you see the campaigns rolling out? I guess, it would be all in the regions, and the village mayor is like going door to door and asking people, or what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the interesting things is that when it comes to campaigning, there's a large majority of the people who are not interested in voting to any party. Yet there is a large percentage or a good number, if I may look at my notes, I think 60 or 70% of people said that they would be participating in elections if they were to happen. So this, in a way, I think means that there's a large number of undecided voters. Right? I haven't looked at the breakdown in terms of rural versus urban areas. Yerevan, rural, usually they categorize it into three, right? Yerevan is a whole category in and by itself. There's urban and then there's rural. So I don't know how that would work, but I think campaigning is going to be quite stiff, quite competitive, because if this poll is any indicator, and to some extent it is, there are a lot of undecided voters, and what is going to be the agenda and the platform. Within this context, I think the individual component, going back to what Emil was mentioning about which leader you prefer and so on, I have to point out that there is a dichotomy between the office of the prime minister, trust in the office of the prime minister, and favorable or unfavorable perceptions about the cabinet. And they make a distinction in this. So there is a huge gap between how much people trust the office of the prime minister. In other words, this is another. It's a euphemism for Pashinyan versus the cabinet. So he is going to probably put in a lot of effort in campaigning. On the other hand, Yerevan being the bulk of the voters coming from Yerevan, it's very much fragmented, and it really depends on what's going to happen between now and whenever the elections happen, which I don't think that will happen anytime in the next 6 months, probably closer to the fall or the winter.
All right. And Alan, any thoughts on this particular issue?
I was just looking at the poll, and it was interesting to me that there wasn't a question posed in the way of like, should Nikol Pashinyan resign? I feel like that's one question that the opposition is pushing right now, that we want Nikol Pashinyan's resignation, and then the subsequent steps will be determined at that point. That would have been an interesting question to ask.
And I think that number is pretty high based on the previous the MPI polls. Yeah, so I think that's a good point there, Alan. Anything else you want to mention about these polls? Like, for instance, the other question that I think was interesting, I wanted to quickly cover, is trust in institutions. When they asked what institution, in terms of, I guess, let me find the question and I'll read it over again.
While you're looking at that, 𝐊𝐫𝐫, did anyone find it interesting that 98% of the people did not have a political affiliation?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's, again, not surprising.
I mean, this is the case in like many countries. I mean, in the U.S. also, you don't have a lot of people who are party affiliation. They tend to vote this way or that way. They're apolitical when it comes to, well, not apartisan, let's call it that way. But when you mentioned 98 aspect, Bedrosian, I think it's quite interesting. One question about Armenians with dual citizenship should be provided the opportunity to serve in the National Assembly as appointed as minister or as president. Yes. And in the parliament, they 50% said yes and 48% said no. So there is probably an interest in terms of, and I don't get this as diasporans, by the way. The way I look at it, probably when you say people with dual citizens, they would think of people with Russian and Armenian citizenship more often than not, rather than Americans or so on. But I might be mistaken in this case. But when it comes to president, definitely it goes down, and even less so as a prime minister. But it seems that there is probably a malaise or tiredness from the same old politicians being in the National Assembly or as ministers, cabinet ministers.
A level of caution.
Yeah. So and the specific question I was referring to previously was around, I guess, trust in institutions, and this was interesting. So the army has 73%, and this is it's the number one institution they listed. Police 63%, the ombudsman's office 60%, local authorities 56%. Then number 5 comes prime minister at 54%, and the Armenian Apostolic Church at 52%, which is surprising to me. And I guess there is a separate question with the favorability rating of the prime minister, which was at 55%. Isn't this a drop from previous polls? Even if, let's say, we take the same poll and compare it to itself from previous polls.
Yeah, of course it is a drop, no doubt about it. It's a drop for all institutions, but I have to say the drop for the army was actually less than I anticipated. Yeah. Considering that the government is trying to blame the army for what happened.
I think the army was around 85 to 90.
But they're still before they were, and now they're a little bit less, but they're still the highest rated. The church drop actually is surprising, considering that the church sort of stays out of most things in Armenia. and just sort of deals with
how much was the church
stuff.
Drop?
I think it's also substantial, like 30% or so. But yeah, it's probably it comes down to sampling. I think the sampling questions are real, especially when you have few pollsters and regular polling like this. Irregular.
I'm not sure about the previous results, but I think the Human Rights Defender's Office might have increased in favorability.
I agree with that
as well. And also the drop of the president's office. I was surprised that one thing didn't write the response. I wasn't surprised with the results in terms of favorability, but the fact that the president's office has less favorability than unfavorability, but also less favorability than the office of the prime minister was, I wouldn't call it a shock, but I was amused by that. Let's call it that way. Because I would have expected that the president's office would be above politics and people would think of it as something, as a unifier and so on.
Yeah, I think that's deteriorating. But I think one positive outcome of this was that a substantial majority, 61%, want term limits for prime minister, whoever is prime minister. and two-term limit that doesn't exist currently, and that's something that's not on the political agenda, but I think that should be on the political agenda.
But
if
Emil, this is
anybody's
one of the
taken
things
seriously.
about the parliamentary system I think a lot of people don't understand. I mean, I don't. I am trying to think. I actually did a quick search. I couldn't find anything, and I have to admit it was a shallow search. But in a parliamentary system, you cannot have a term limit on a prime minister.
No, you can.
The
You can.
logic
It
is
depends on what you agree on. You can. It depends on what parties agree on. If there is an agreement on term limits, then there is an agreement on term limits. It might not be just terms in terms of like one term. If it's incomplete term, two incomplete terms, it might be a years in terms of how many years the prime minister can serve. But
by default, a parliamentary system assumes that you're voting for parties to get into the parliament, and whatever the party you're putting, quote unquote, again, I'm talking hypothetically, the party is the one that decides who's going to govern. Now, it's almost always the leader of the party, but there have been cases where other people, non-leaders of a party, have been appointed. The most notable case in my mind is India, when Sonia Gandhi won the election, the Indian National Congress. She refused to be prime minister, and she nominated another person who was not the leader of the party. I think, by the way, a manifestation of this, the reason why I'm putting this in this context about the parliamentary system is because I think to some extent the mistrust or the unfavorability of political parties is also a manifestation of the parliamentary system, where the political parties have become more accentuated, their role or their job or their function has become more accentuated. Hence, people are looking at them less favorably.
Okay, let's move on. So on March 12th, the chair of Armenia's Security Council, Armen Grigoryan, gave an interview to CivilNet, which added several new pieces of detail on what was taking place in the Armenian government circles, but also brought up many new questions, at least to me. Asbet Kochikyan, what is the role of the Security Council in Armenia? So maybe give us a brief overview of that, and how does it fit in the decision-making process on defense issues, and especially during the war? And also, if you watched the interview, what are your impressions? Anything that you found remarkable from this interview?
I didn't listen to the interview. I read the highlights from the interview, and Emil would be better suited in terms of filling in the gaps that I'm going to mention here in terms of the role of the National Security Council. It has always been relegated to a secondary role because of the personalities, even during the first president's time when it was first created, this body was created. It was also a place where people who received or were to receive political favors were appointed as Security Council secretaries under different presidents and so on. I don't believe that the National Security Council in Armenia has the same job or the same job description as you would see in the United States or in other places. It is an aggregate. It is a nexus, perhaps, of all the important decision makers in power ministries, the prime minister's office, and so on. Interestingly, not the president. The president is excluded in this process since the constitutional amendment, but it hasn't lived to its potential of what it could do in terms of coordinating. And probably this has always been the problem, but also probably this is also one of the issues of miscommunication between the various security agencies, power ministries, and eventually the mismanagement of the war, before the war, during the war, and what they're doing now. And it has come to, down to finding enemies or finding blame. So, and Emil, I'm sure you're better sort of versed in terms of talking about the details.
Emil, I wanted to ask you actually. I sensed that the key theme of the interview was to correct the record about Oni Gasparyan. It seemed that Grigoryan returned.
Yeah, but let me
step
back. Let me step back and sort of echo what Asbet said. The role of the Security Council, and actually the role of the job of the Secretary of the Security Council, has been peculiar. There have been national security advisors such as Gerard Libaridian and to some extent Armen Grigoryan, who were strong figures just because they had the trust respectively of Ter-Petrosyan and Kocharian to be envoys for them on different matters. However, in the last number of years, and especially it was clear with Artur Bagdasaryan when he was the secretary for Serge Sargsyan, that this is a very token position, and as a matter of fact, they have built a separate building, right, for the Security Council, so they do their own consulting on sort of on the side of real politics, which happened either in Bagram 26 or now in Republic Square. And that was actually my comment to Armen Grigoryan's appointment, my first question was actually whether he would sit in the Prime Minister's office or he would sit in a separate building. And when it became clear that he would sit in Artur Bagdasaryan's building, then he would be the sort of token Karabakhzi, in this government that really had now no role in real decision making. And in the sense that, considering that Armen Grigoryan and also David Sanasaryan were sort of the other leaders of the protest movement, it looked like both Sanasaryan, and it was obviously clear with Sanasaryan and also with Armen Grigoryan, sort of was shoved outside of the public limelight to make sure that there is no competition with Nikol Pashinyan's monopoly on the protest leadership. So yeah, the Security Council in general has very little role in Armenia. However, in terms of war conditions, clearly there has to be constant process of discussion and taking decisions, regular process. And the most glaring part of this interview that Armen Grigoryan gave was that he said that they only met twice during the entire conflict. They met on the 4th day and they met on the 19th of October. Yep. And both times it seemed basically Armenia was not on a war footing as it was supposed to be on a war footing, and basically you had this couple of discussions and that was it. So they met once at the end of September, once after the middle of October, and this is while a catastrophe was taking place in Armenia. A catastrophic event was taking place, and Nikol Pashinyan spent most of the time giving interviews to foreign media and Facebook posting and stuff.
So Onik Gasparyan actually stated that on the 4th day of the war, he warned the government, and I believe it was in reference to the specific meeting that they held on the 4th day of the war, that we're doing bad.
He referred to the Security Council meeting, yeah.
Right, and we're doing bad, and we should try to stop the war at any cost. And he also talked about the October 19th meeting. But Armen Grigoryan mentioned specifically several times that only Gasparyan did not bring this issue up. So it appeared that essentially he's calling Onik out here and saying that never happened.
Yeah. Clearly, the point of the interview was to contradict the Onik Gasparyan narrative. And hopefully there is a record of what was said at those meetings. And this was since they were formal Security Council meetings, and they should disclose if Armen Grigoryan claims that they could disclose that information. Now there is a little secrecy as far as what happened at the time, so they could present evidence of it. I can't exclude the possibility that in his statement, Onik Gasparyan, after probably 44 days of not sleeping, might have confused exact meeting that he said what and in what form and how it was understood at the time and wasn't. Those things can happen. Bottom line is, this interview is another confirmation of just dramatic failure of this current government to be able to handle a crisis situation.
Yeah. Alen, what are your thoughts?
Armen Grigoryan basically said that Onik Gasparyan didn't make that statement on the 4th day. I think he hinted at the fact that he made the statement at the next Security Council meeting on the 19th, which raises the question, why wasn't the war stopped within days of that meeting? So, like Emil said, maybe the days were mixed up, but even after the 19th meeting, the war went on for another 3 weeks with a lot more losses. The other interesting thing to me about this interview was he didn't really answer many questions. He just had like 2 or 3 talking points. One of them was contradicting Onik Gasparyan's statements, but when asked about the actual war, about why we withdrew from Zangelan Kubatlu, even though the agreement had said we would, forces, everyone would stop where they were, or when he was asked about Shushi, or why we hadn't prepared for the war in terms of weapons acquisitions or changing the plan for what weapons we were going to acquire. He was dodging the questions. He didn't really answer any of the questions.
Kudos to CivilNet's Arshaliz Magdasyan for putting the proper questions. You have very few interviewers in Armenia, who have both access and also have ability to actually question the officials.
Right.
Okay. So let's move on to the next and final issue on our agenda today, which is the elections. So, after Prime Minister Pashinyan lost the support of the Joint Chief of Staffs of the Army, on Monday he came back to and announced that he's again open to snap elections. If you remember, the topic was put to sleep for a while. If you recall, he previously announced that he was open to snap elections, then cancelled it, claiming that there was no popular demand for it, and now we're back. Essentially, Pashinyan has laid down some conditions, however. For example, he wants to do a tactical resignation, but first he wants all the parties to sign an MOU to not nominate any other Prime Minister candidate. it. What's new this week is President Armen Sargsyan invited Nikol Pashinyan, MyStep, and the parliamentary opposition, as well as the Homeland Salvation Movement, to negotiations around the issue of early parliamentary elections. This was all after the conflict with the military. The meeting didn't take place in the suggested format. Even though Pashinyan and the president met separately, the main meeting didn't take place due to the lack of consensus on the agenda. Edmund Marukyan, as we said, from Bright Armenia, accepted the offer and indicated that their faction may comply with Pashinyan's demands not to nominate any candidate. And this is a change in their position, since prior to the military tussle, they were rejecting this idea. And so that's the main change of the situation. And the Homeland Salvation Movement has remained static in terms of their demands. This movement includes the Republican Party, the ARF, Prosperous Armenia. They, in turn, accepted the proposal, but they set their own preconditions, saying that the meeting must be held in parliament, it must be in public forum, and must be broadcast live. They also reiterated their demands, saying that first, actually, Pashinyan must resign, then a temporary government must be in control of Armenia, and then snap elections. And Gagik Zarukin also reiterated these points. So, Asbet Kochikyan, I wanted to ask you, very high level, do you believe that Pashinyan truly wants early elections, or is this some kind of a political maneuvering?
Well, absolutely political maneuvering. I think he has another 3 years potentially, but I think this is another way to feel around the opposition. And the fact that Zarukin refused that he's going to sign such an MOU might actually not allow him to follow that path of resignation and snap elections, right? Because if I'm not mistaken, it's not just because of the fact that the prime minister resigns and 2 attempts are made to appoint a prime minister and it's successful, and then you can have a snap elections, early elections. It can also be by a majority of the National Assembly deciding that we're going to have snap elections. So I think it's just an attempt to see what's going on, what the opposition's reaction will be. Because this has been going back and forth in terms of, as we said, snap on, snap off. I personally do not think that realistically snap elections will happen anytime sooner than late fall, early probably in December, if at all they happen. Again, with these developments constantly occurring, I think a lot could change until then.
What developments do you have in mind, Aspen?
I don't know. That's the thing that it could be any kind of a development. It could be political, it could be military, it could be any kind of a development. See, in my mind, whenever I think about snap elections, especially when it comes to developed countries, right? The government decides that, I have a favorable rating now. I have like 60% people favoring my policies, and then I'll have elections in 3 months. But then within those 3 months, like it happened in England, actually, a couple of years ago, when there was a terrorist attack at one of the concerts, and that actually brought down the government's rating, and they didn't get as many seats as they wanted. That's the thing in my mind, at least in terms of snap elections, should be at least 3 months ahead of time. But at this point, I don't see that happening in the next 3 months because things are still in motion. As incompetent or as unsure Pashinyan is, I think he's willing to wait and see how things will work out so that he can have some kind of a leverage in his hand. Look, I did this, or look, I did that kind of a thing. And then call for elections.
Emil, actually, I wanted to ask you then, the demand for this abstention from nominating any prime minister candidate seems very weird to me, given that Pashinyan's party and MyStep parliamentary faction control or have more than 80 parliamentarians and could easily secure a failure of the vote for the PM, thus triggering the snap elections. Why are these preconditions being put forth by Pashinyan?
Well, definitely I can make a statement that there is not 80 people that Pashinyan trusts. I don't even know if there is more than 1 or 2 people that Pashinyan trusts. So 80 people for him is too many. It's too many people. It tells me that if there was a capable political operatives in Armenia, they could actually have been able to make inroads into the majority and sort of secure a lifting of the military rule and basically remove Pashinyan. Bottom line is, Armenian constitution provides for this situation that we have right now, where you have a failing prime minister and you have a parliament that can make that determination. Is that prime minister failing or not failing? Calling new elections, I don't think is a way out of a crisis that Armenia is facing right now. I think it's going to perpetuate the crisis because we have a history of Armenian elections when winners claim the elections were fair and they fairly elected, and the losers claim that they were unfair. So especially in contested elections, close elections, that this is likely to be. So I don't see any election bringing about a resolution to a political crisis. I think it's going to deepen it, might actually create additional problems. But the method is there. The method is, if there is a political operative in Armenia that can work with the body, the physical body of the Armenian parliament, the sort of the shareholders of the Armenian national government, to replace a failing prime minister and achieve the transition that way, I think that would be a much more direct route to overcoming the crisis that we're having there in Armenia right now.
There was an interesting interview with Tevan Pogosyan on 168 related to that, where he predicted that we will be heading actually towards snap parliamentary elections, but he also didn't agree that best interests of Armenia. In fact, he said that early snap parliamentary elections with Nikol in power would be the worst possible outcome for Armenia right now. Alan, what are your thoughts? Do you agree with this? And how do you see the resolution to this conflict?
Yeah, I do agree that having snap elections anytime in the next few months or even the next year is going to be very problematic. The society is highly polarized. The atmosphere is very emotionally charged. The campaign leading up to the election is going to be problematic. It's going to be hard, for instance, for people to go and campaign in certain areas. There's a lot of anger right now. Even the government is going to have a hard time. For instance, they can't even go to 𝐁𝐬𝐛𝐞𝐝 right now. So how are they really going to be campaigning? And the election itself, I imagine, is going to be hard to conduct in a reasonable way. And then, like Emil said, it doesn't matter who wins. There's going to be a lot of discontent with the outcome of the election. So I don't see that as a solution right now. Maybe in a year, maybe with a transitional government taking over and calming things down, trying to change the rhetoric a little bit so that it's not so much animosity and hostility in society. I feel like it wouldn't be a good idea to hold elections under Nikol Pashinyan, first of all, and second of all, anytime in the next few months to a year.
Well, what I've heard us say here is that the IRI poll results are a tailor-made excuse for Pashinyan to call off the early elections yet again.
If they were tailor-made, would they be any different than what they were, I guess?
The results did correlate with the other poll by AMA. Main question is favorability and unfavorability of the current prime minister and what the opposition can expect. So I think those are in line. They still have considerable support for Nikol Pashinyan from the have-nots, the masses, who expect basically the government to focus on the Bolshevik agenda rather than on the nationalist agenda.
All right, I think that brings us to the end of our episode today. I wanted to thank everyone for joining and thank you for the listeners, and talk to you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
That concludes our program for this Week in Review episode. We hope it has helped your understanding of some of the issues from the previous week. We look forward to your feedback and your suggestions for issues to cover in greater depth. Contact us on our website at grung.org or on our Facebook page, ANN-Grung, or in our Facebook group, Grung-Armenian News Network. Special thanks to Laura Osborne for providing the music for our podcast. On behalf of everyone in this episode, we wish you a good week. Don't forget to subscribe to our channels, like our pages, and follow us on social media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.